I know we've talked quarterback a little bit, and I don't want to make this, into the quarterback show, but got to give the people what they want a little bit as we look into that kind of lower, not lower tier, but maybe second tier of quarterbacks. And Mitch, maybe we can use this to kind of transition from Bank to Tank, because I think there were a lot of ups and downs for these four guys that we have listed here in our show doc. We've mentioned Michael Penix, we mentioned Bo Nix, but I want to throw Spencer Rattler and Sam Hartman in there as well. Like I mentioned, lots of ups and downs for both of those guys. The quarterbacks obviously have the biggest microscope on them throughout this whole week. What were your takeaways for those four guys? Who's moving up? Who's moving down?
Yeah, I mean, hey, you got to have good quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl, because then if you start getting bad throws, unfortunately, some things like we saw from Joe Milton, then it's hard to evaluate receivers and DBs. Had to. I mean, it's just one of those where you got to get good balls, because then you're able to run your 7-on-7s appropriately. And that
to the point, I think a lot of people might have tuned out after they saw Bo Nix, not hitting those throws early in the week. That's kind of what went viral early in the week. And then he turned it around and had a okay showing, pretty decent showing on Saturday.
Yeah. I mean, I'd even go to a good showing as well on the third day of practice, for example. So we start working through quarterbacks. I mean, you've got a guy like Spencer Rattler that improved his stock. He didn't blow me away. I think part of it is the first impression to me. Day one of practice was not that good, and he finished off by throwing a pick at the end of it, and it kind of ended with a sour taste in that way. If you get toward the end of practice, you're going best on best, and he came away with that. But then you start to put that aside and say, okay, things get better, and they get better and better throughout the week. Then he wins the MVP, and that's one that with Rattler, I have a bit of a back and forth on whether he's a top 100 pick or not in this draft. That's what the battle is for me of, it's not, should he be a second rounder? I'm not close to that. I'm looking at South Carolina, I think, and that way he elevated their offense. And he was the type of guy that you knew coming in, for example, covering Clemson, even though South Carolina wasn't quite as good this year as they were the year before when they beat Clemson, you come in and say, hey, it's Spencer Rattler. Like, he's got some juice to him. He can beat you. And he was able to elevate the South Carolina offense. So I don't take that lightly. I think he had some good receivers with him, but to me, he made people better, and he made that offense work, and he won them games. So you combine that with the fact that he's got some natural arm talent. There was a time where we thought he might be a QB1 in this draft back a few years ago. I know it feels like a long time, but he does have some of those just natural abilities as a football thrower. I think, to me, I look at the process, or I look at day one, for example, a few throws that were off the mark because he was getting used to receivers, but he also showed the ability to get settled and not let it phase him. And a big focus for him in terms of the rhetoric around his media presence was talking about how he's matured, and not just since the TV show when he was in high school, but even since that in college, of going from Oklahoma and then learning lessons at South Carolina. And that approach to me is, okay, I see what you're doing. I think you're doing the right things. You're saying the right things. And the overall product to me, some of the sharpness that we saw in the game on Saturday, for example, is enough for me to say, yeah, maybe, 90 to 100 is the range for me, but I'm not really bumping him up into the middle of the third round or above. So I'm thinking maybe late third, early fourth is where I sit on Rattler. And I don't see him as an NFL starter. I see him as a quality backup, kind of what I would think Desmond Ridder probably projects as in the NFL, is someone that if he has to start games, if someone's hurt in front of him, you say good. But if he's your franchise quarterback, you're a little concerned. That's kind of how I feel about Rattler and his projection. So to me, that's a draftable player of mid-third round to end of the third, maybe early fourth. You start to feel really good about that pick. But that to me is the range.
So with Penix and Nix, right, they've stolen the headlines all year long, the most electric offenses in college football, and then you get them into a pro-style setting, and all of a sudden a lot of those bandwagon folks that were just sure they were going to be leaders of the free world in the NFL are starting to see maybe they were just in really, really good systems, right? I mean, you're going to hear the stats for Bo Nix, right? I mean, throwing it, 5 yards down the field, like he was the beneficiary of some yak gods at Oregon. Penix could throw the deep ball, but when it comes to playing a pro-style defense like he did against Michigan, it felt like he was lost, confused, didn't know where that read was if they had his safety valve taken away. What did you see from each of those quarterbacks in Mobile, and did one of them kind of separate from the other?
I think Penix did separate from Nix a little bit just with what we saw on the field. I think it was really more of a testament of Penix came out, and there were some times where I didn't really notice him, which in a way is good because that means the balls were, solid. He was getting it to the guys. He was doing his thing. Wasn't in the Senior Bowl. Sometimes you don't have an opportunity to make as many freakish plays as you may want to. There's a time for that. There's obviously the different drills, but in the general realm of practice, balls are coming out strong and he's doing his thing, and felt like he got into a groove pretty quickly as far as a Senior Bowl practice with new receivers can go. But for Nix, he did start to catch some eyes of, you'd see a ball and say, wait, what was that? You're like, who threw that? Oh, it was Nix? Really? There were a few of those of like, he threw that. That was not what I was expecting. A couple of sideline routes, for example. There was one that he threw out to the far sideline and kind of popped it over a guy's head, and it was that 10 yards downfield. And I was like, Nix. I thought he was about 80% completion this year. And that was something that I was like, oh, okay, noted. We'll see what happens. We'll see how it progresses. And it's also something to manage too, of like, how much do you play? How much do you throw at these events when you've got these kinds of grades? So credit to both of them for coming out, for throwing, for doing their thing, especially in practices. But to me, Penix was the better guy in terms of the draft. I feel more comfortable drafting Penix than Nix at this point. I do feel pretty good about both of them as quarterbacks, but Penix to me is late first, and Nix to me, I think, has fallen from mid to late first consideration into now being more of a second round grade. And I'm looking at him maybe 35 to 40. If my team had a high second round pick and took Bo Nix, I'd be very happy. But end of the first, if that's the top guy you're picking in a draft and you're hinging your future on that, I don't feel comfortable with Bo, and I feel more comfortable that way with Michael Penix. So that to me is where I am. Penix being somewhere in the 20s, and then Nix being somewhere in the 30s, maybe touching early 40s.
So I'm curious, with Penix, would you say QB4 behind Williams, May, and Daniels, or is there a case for him to be the third quarterback taken?
I'm going to go 4. Yeah, I think that feels about right. Yeah, I like Daniels. I mean, just the explosiveness. Gamer. He's someone that would be a good fit in Atlanta if the Falcons were to do something. I don't know if they'd pick him, right where they are. But that would be if, you don't trade up into the top 3, that might be the type of guy you like to take there, for example, to put in a Atlanta kind of system, even though that's changed. So different now.
What is the Atlanta system?
Yeah, I was going to say, wait, a little different now.
Where did old Arthur end up again? He got an OC job, didn't he?
Which one?
Where did Arthur end up?
Oh, Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, boy. I mean, they're not completely sold on Kenny Pickett, from what I understand.
Oh, we'll see. Senior Bowl quarterback a couple of years ago. Yeah,
there you go.
True.
Hand size. That was the big story of that week.
Yeah, that hand gate was certainly a heck of a storyline.
Gracious, how about that?